in honor of Edith Cavell, the British nurse who went to her death like a saint before a German firing squad on October 12, 1915. Her crime? She had hidden and fed and nursed wounded French and English soldiers in her Belgian home and had helped them escape into Holland. As the English chaplain entered her cell in the military prison in Brussels that October morning to prepare her for death, Edith Cavell uttered two sentences that have been preserved in bronze and granite. "I realize that patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness toward anyone." 4 years later, her body was removed to England, and memorial services were held in Westminster Abbey. I once spent a year in London. I have often stood before the statue of Edith Cavell opposite the National Portrait Gallery and read her immortal words carved in granite. I realize that patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness toward anyone. One sure way to forgive and forget our enemies is to become absorbed in some cause infinitely bigger than ourselves. Then the insults and the enmities we encounter won't matter, because we will be oblivious of everything but our cause. As an example, let's take an intensely dramatic event that was about to take place in the pine woods of Mississippi back in 1918, a lynching. Lawrence Jones, a black teacher and preacher, was about to be lynched. Some years ago I visited the school that Lawrence Jones founded, the Piney Woods Country School, and I spoke before the student body. That school is nationally known today, but the incident I'm going to relate occurred long before that. It occurred back in the highly emotional days of the First World War. A rumor had spread through central Mississippi that the Germans were arousing the blacks and inciting them to rebellion. Lawrence Jones, the man who was about to be lynched, was, as I have already said, a black himself and was accused of helping to arouse his race to insurrection. A group of white men, pausing outside the church, had heard Lawrence Jones shouting to his congregation, "Life is a battle in which every black must gird on his armor and fight to survive and succeed." Fight, armor. Enough. Galloping off into the night, these excited young men recruited a mob, returned to the church, put a rope around the preacher, dragged him for a mile up the road, stood him on a heap of kindling, lighted matches, and were about to hang him and burn him at the same time when someone shouted, "Let's make the blankety-blank-blank talk before he burns." Speech! Speech! Lawrence Jones, standing on the kindling, spoke with the rope around his neck, spoke for his life and his cause. He had been graduated from the University of Iowa in 1907. His sterling character, his scholarship, and his musical ability had made him popular with both the students and the faculty. Upon graduation, he had turned down the offer of a hotel man to set him up in business, and had turned down the offer of a wealthy man to finance his musical education. Why? Because he was on fire with a vision. Reading the story of Booker T. Washington's life, he'd been inspired to devote his own life to educating the poverty-stricken, illiterate members of his race. So he went to the most backward belt he could find in the South, a spot 25 miles south of Jackson, Mississippi. Pawning his watch for $1.65, he started his school in the open woods with a stump for a desk. Lawrence Jones told these angry men who were waiting to lynch him of the struggle he had had to educate these unschooled boys and girls and to train them to be good farmers, mechanics, cooks, housekeepers. He told of the white men who had helped him in his struggle to establish Piney Woods Country School, white men who had given him land, lumber, and pigs, cows, and money to help him carry on his educational work. When Lawrence Jones talked with sincere and moving eloquence, as he pleaded not for himself but his cause, the mob began to soften. Finally, an old Confederate veteran in the crowd said, "I believe this boy's telling the truth. I know the white men whose names he has mentioned. He's doing fine work. We have made a mistake. We ought to help him instead of hang him." the Confederate veteran passed his hat through the crowd and raised a gift of $52.40 from the very men who had gathered there to hang the founder of the Piney Woods Country School, the man who said, "I have no time to quarrel, no time for regrets, and no man can force me to stoop low enough to hate him." Epictetus pointed out 19 centuries ago that we reap what we sow, and that somehow fate almost always makes us pay for our malefactions. In the long run, said Epictetus, every man will pay the penalty for his own misdeeds. The man who remembers this will be angry with no one, indignant with no one, revile no one, blame no one, offend no one, hate no one. Probably no other man in American history was ever more denounced and hated and double-crossed than Lincoln. Yet Lincoln, according to Herndon's classic biography, never judged men by his like or dislike for them. If any given act was to be performed, he could understand that his enemy could do it just as well as anyone. If a man had maligned him or had been guilty of personal ill-treatment and was the fittest man for the place, Lincoln would give him that place just as soon as he would give it to a friend. I do not think he ever removed a man because he was his enemy or because he disliked him. Lincoln was denounced and insulted by some of the very men he had appointed to positions of high power, men like McClellan, Seward, Stanton, and Chase. Yet Lincoln believed, according to Herndon, his law partner, that no man was to be eulogized for what he did, or censured for what he did or did not do, because all of us are the children of conditions, of circumstances, of environment, of education, of acquired habits, and of heredity, molding men as they are and will forever be. Perhaps Lincoln was right. If you and I had inherited the same physical, mental, and emotional characteristics that our enemies have inherited, and if life had done to us what it has done to them, we would act exactly as they do. We couldn't possibly do anything else. Let's be charitable enough to repeat the prayer of the Sioux Indians. O Great Spirit, keep me from ever judging and criticizing a man until I have walked in his moccasins for 2 weeks. So, instead of hating our enemies, let's pity them and thank God that life has not made us what they are. Instead of heaping condemnation and revenge upon our enemies, let us give them our understanding, our sympathy, our help, our forgiveness, and our prayers. I was brought up in a family which read the Scriptures or repeated a verse from the Bible each night, and then knelt down and said family prayers. I can still hear my father in a lonely Missouri farmhouse repeating these words of Jesus, words that will continue to be repeated as long as man cherishes his ideals. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. My father tried to live those words of Jesus, and they gave him an inner peace that the captains and the kings of earth have often sought for in vain. To cultivate a mental attitude that will bring you peace and happiness, remember that Rule 2 is, let's never try to get even with our enemies, because if we do, we will hurt ourselves far more than we hurt them. Let's do as General Eisenhower does. Let's never waste a minute thinking about people we don't like. Chapter 14. If you do this, you will never worry about ingratitude. I recently met a businessman in Texas who was burned up with indignation. I was warned that he would tell me about it within 15 minutes after I met him. He did. The incident he was angry about had occurred 11 months previously, but he was still burned up about it. He couldn't talk of anything else. He had given his 34 employees $10,000 in Christmas bonuses, approximately $300 each, and no one had thanked him. I am sorry, he complained bitterly, that I ever gave them a penny. An angry man, said Confucius, is always full of poison. This man was so full of poison that I honestly pitied him. He was about 60 years old. Now, life insurance companies figure that on the average we will live slightly more than 2/3 of the difference between our present age and 80. So this man, if he was lucky, probably had about 14 or 15 years to live. Yet he had already wasted almost one of his few remaining years by his bitterness and resentment over an event that was past and gone. I pitied him. Instead of wallowing in resentment and self-pity, he might have asked himself why he didn't get any appreciation. Maybe he'd underpaid and overworked his employees. Maybe they considered a Christmas bonus not a gift, but something they had earned. Maybe he was so critical and unapproachable that no one dared or cared to thank him. Maybe they felt he gave the bonus because most of the profits were going for taxes anyway. On the other hand, maybe the employees were selfish, mean, and ill-mannered. Maybe this, maybe that. I don't know any more about it than you do. But I do know that Dr. Samuel Johnson said, "Gratitude is a fruit of great cultivation. You do not find it among gross people." Now, here's the point I'm trying to make. This man made the human and distressing mistake of expecting gratitude. He just didn't know human nature. If you saved a man's life, would you expect him to be grateful? You might, but Samuel Leibowitz, who was a famous criminal lawyer before he became a judge, saved 78 men from going to the electric chair. How many of these men do you suppose stopped to thank Samuel Leibowitz or ever took the trouble to send him a Christmas card? How many? Guess. That's right, none. Christ helped 10 lepers in one afternoon, but how many of these lepers ever stopped to thank him? Only one. Look it up in St. Luke. When Christ turned around to his disciples and asked, "Where are the other 9?" they had all run away, disappeared without thanks. Let me ask you a question. Why should you and I, or this businessman in Texas, expect more thanks for our small favors than was given Jesus Christ? And when it comes to money matters, well, that's even more hopeless. Charles Schwab told me that he once saved a bank cashier who had speculated in the stock market with funds belonging to the bank. Schwab put up the money to save this man from going to the penitentiary. Was the cashier grateful? Oh, yes, for a little while. Then he turned against Schwab and reviled him and denounced him, the very man who kept him out of jail. If you gave one of your relatives $1 million, would you expect him to be grateful? Andrew Carnegie did just that. But if Andrew Carnegie had come back from the grave a little while later, he would have been shocked to find this relative cursing him. Why? Because old Andy had left $365 million to public charities and had cut him off with one measly million, as he put it. That's how it goes. Human nature has always been human nature, and it probably won't change in your lifetime, so why not accept it? Why not be as realistic about it as was old Marcus Aurelius, one of the wisest men who ever ruled the Roman Empire? He wrote in his diary one day, "I am going to meet people today who talk too much, people who are selfish, egotistical, ungrateful, but I won't be surprised or disturbed, for I couldn't imagine a world without such people." That makes sense, doesn't it? If you and I go around grumbling about ingratitude, who is to blame? Is it human nature, or is it our ignorance of human nature? Let's not expect gratitude. Then, if we get some occasionally, it will come as a delightful surprise. If we don't get it, we won't be disturbed. Here's the first point I'm trying to make in this chapter. It is natural for people to forget to be grateful. So if we go around expecting gratitude, we're heading straight for a lot of headaches. I know a woman in New York who's always complaining because she's lonely. Not one of her relatives wants to go near her, and no wonder. If you visit her, she'll tell you for hours what she did for her nieces when they were children. She nursed them through the measles and the mumps and the whooping cough. She boarded them for years. She helped to send one of them through business school, and she made a home for the other until she got married. Do the nieces come to see her? Oh, yes, now and then, out of a spirit of duty. But they dread these visits. They know they will have to sit and listen for hours to half-veiled reproaches.